The house at Rue Saint-Cloîtres stood with the plainness of many others on that narrow street. Its shutters painted a dull cream, its steps scrubbed clean each morning by a woman whose face bore neither warmth nor cruelty, only duty. Travelers saw it as a refuge, a cheap stop between the railway and the market square, a place that promised warm broth, clean sheets, and a roof that did not leak when the rain pressed down on the old stone town. Nothing about it caught the eye longer than a glance, which was exactly how Henri Marchand preferred it. For the Marchands had learned that the most successful predator was never the wolf that showed its teeth, but the one that wore the manners of a lamb. Inside, the walls smelled faintly of soap and boiled cabbage, a comfort to the poor and the drifting who sought its shelter. Henri the patriarch kept his voice calm, almost priestly when welcoming boarders. He asked no questions beyond their names and their payment, noting the details in a ledger that never left his side. His wife, Louise, moved with quiet efficiency, her eyes lowered as if in humility, her hands quick with trays and linens. Their daughter Madeleine, still a girl to outsiders, played in the courtyard with a skipping rope, her laughter thin but innocent enough to soften any suspicion. To enter that house was to believe you had stepped into the embrace of modest, industrious people. The truth lay in the silence that pressed around the place at night. Guests noticed it only when the street itself had gone quiet, when shutters closed and candles went out across the neighborhood. In other homes there were sounds of quarrels, footsteps, whispers, life. But in the Marchand house, once the doors locked, silence held like a seal. Even those who lodged inside found that the walls swallowed noise in an unnatural way, as though the house did not want the world to hear what went on within. Few lingered on the thought. Weariness made them grateful for quiet. That was the first mistake every guest made. The family's order was rehearsed like ritual. Henri rose before dawn to check the cellar door, his hand brushing the iron key that hung from a chain around his neck. Louise prepared pots of broth in exact portions, measuring sprigs of herbs and drops of tinctures with the same precision one might use in a sick room. The house was not simply kept clean. It was polished into sterility, its corners scrubbed raw until no dust dared remain. To the boarders, it seemed a mark of pride. In truth, it was an obsession born of the need to erase every trace of what passed inside those walls, to maintain the illusion of a house without history, a table without stains. Behind their polite nods lay a hunger that could never show itself in daylight. Henri studied every boarder the way a collector studies a specimen. He watched how they walked, how their hands trembled when they lifted a spoon, how their eyes shifted when he mentioned the curfew of the house. He stored these details away in his ledger, notes written in code, as if he were charting not men and women but experiments waiting for their turn. Louise, for her part, was the enabler cloaked in maternal care. She fed them heartily, but there was always an aftertaste in her meals, a dull bitterness that guests blamed on herbs. It softened their thoughts, made their limbs heavy, prepared them for what waited when sleep came. The townspeople noticed none of it. To them, the Marchands were model caretakers, offering shelter in a world where the poor too often froze in doorways or rotted in workhouses. Their reputation was built on restraint, on the absence of scandal, on their silence. No boarder ever left angry or cheated because no boarder ever left at all. Their absence was mistaken for transience, the assumption that travelers had simply moved on. In this way, the Marchands thrived not by hiding from sight, but by hiding in plain sight, cultivating trust in order to betray it. The house itself seemed to share in their deception. Its beams groaned with age, its floorboards whispered when pressed, but never loudly enough to reveal what they held. Even the neighbors, when asked years later, would say they noticed nothing unusual beyond the Marchands' devotion to cleanliness and their unwillingness to gossip. Yet every corner of that house had been built into a trap, every ritual of the family designed to mask the quiet machinery of disappearance. As the years stretched, Rue Saint-Cloîtres forgot to ask what became of the souls who passed through that doorway. The town believed in the myth of order the Marchands created, because it was easier than imagining what could grow in silence. And while candles burned low in other houses, in this one the darkness was alive, humming with secrets that would take decades to be uncovered. The story of the Marchand family begins here, in a house that looked like any other, a house where routine and politeness were weapons sharper than knives, where silence itself became the first instrument of death. And it is within this silence that the true ledger of Henri Marchand begins to reveal itself. Henri Marchand's ledger was bound in dark calfskin, its edges rubbed soft from decades of his careful hands. To the untrained eye, it appeared a simple record of commerce, nothing more than a landlord's routine accounts. The names of lodgers, their payments, their dates of arrival. Each line was written with a precision that bordered on reverence, his script neat and unshaken, as though he feared any untidy mark might betray him. He guarded the book with an intensity others reserved for scripture, keeping it within reach at all times, never allowing Louise or Madeleine to touch it. In the evenings, when the boarders dined in the common room, Henri would sit at his corner desk beneath the flicker of a lamp and update his pages with a concentration that felt holy. Yet what appeared to outsiders as good, record-keeping was in truth the architecture of a darker obsession. The pattern was invisible unless one dared to look beyond the surface. Each name began full and certain, followed by notes on rent paid or tasks done around the house. But every entry ended suddenly, mid-page, with no farewell, no notice of departure. Instead, a faint dash marked the final line, as though the guest had vanished from existence. Henri never crossed names out, never wrote where they had gone, only allowed them to dissolve in silence. To a clerk it might have seemed laziness. To Henri it was the perfection of control, a way of charting human erasure without ever writing the word death. He told himself it was not murder he documented, but absence, a simple vanishing, neat and bloodless on the page. The ledger became more than record. It was the mirror of his mind. Each dash fed his hunger, each blank space proof of his power to remove lives from the order of the world. He did not collect trophies of flesh or trinkets stolen from the dead. He collected names, stripped of futures, pressed flat against paper like insects pinned to a board. In those pages he played both God and historian, deciding who would be remembered and who would dissolve into silence. And because no outsider cared to ask after the poor souls who came through his doors, his archive grew unchallenged, a library of vanished strangers. He studied his book at night with a devotion that unnerved even his wife. Louise once found him hunched over the desk long after midnight, whispering through the names as if reciting prayers. He caressed the margins, tracing invisible connections between the vanished, comparing the length of their stays, the weight they carried when they first arrived, the timbre of their voices. Henri did not see them as men and women. He saw them as variables, as patterns waiting to be perfected. Each absence was data, each missing line part of a larger equation that only he understood. The truth was that Henri had built his entire identity on concealment. In the street he appeared calm, almost humble, his gray coat tidy, his hat modest, his manners polished. No one would believe the quiet man who bowed to priests and offered alms at the church door could also be the author of such a ledger. That was his triumph. He knew the townspeople admired his orderliness, that they whispered of his discipline as an example for others. What they called virtue was in fact camouflage. He hid his sickness not in shadows but in plain daylight, cloaked in the respectability of bookkeeping and routine. As the years passed, the book thickened, Dust never touched it, nor did careless fingers. Each vanished border was preserved in ink, their names fading into the yellowing paper like ghosts sealed inside. Henri sometimes imagined the pages breathing, the ledger alive with the weight of those he had erased. When his hand trembled with age, he steadied himself not out of fear of error, but out of devotion to what the book had become. It was no longer record, but scripture, the chronicle of a family enterprise founded on silence and perfected by his hand. What no one realized was that this ledger, left open on his desk as if it were a simple account book, was in fact the truest confession he would ever make. It carried within its neat lines the memory of 100 deaths without ever mentioning a single one. Its silence was louder than any cry, and though the neighbors who glanced at it saw only sums and dates, the truth waited beneath, hidden in plain sight, a black seed planted in paper. Henri knew that one day someone would read it carefully enough to understand, and on that day the house at Rue Saint-Cloîtres would begin to unravel. For now, though, the ledger grew patiently, line by line, a quiet monument to disappearance. And beneath its calm surface, the cellar of the Marchand house waited, ready to give meaning to the next dash that would soon be written across its pages. Louise Marchand was the face the boarders trusted most. She carried herself with the patience of a mother tending children, her voice always softened at the edges, her gaze lowered in humility. To the hungry, she was a provider of comfort. To the weary, she was the promise of rest. Yet behind that gentle mask lay a cold, precise mind, one that understood the human body better than any physician in town. She knew what mixtures slowed the pulse, what herbs clouded the memory, and what measures of tincture would blur the line between waking and dream. Every ladle of soup she served was measured not only for flavor but for control, each bowl carrying within it the seeds of silence. The boarders never suspected. They arrived from the road gaunt and anxious, carrying grief or poverty like stones on their backs. Louise welcomed them with the warmth they longed for, guiding them to tables already set with bread and steaming broth. The first spoonful eased the gnaw of hunger, the second softened the ache of travel. By the third, they began to feel their limbs heavy, their thoughts wrapped in fog. They would smile at her in gratitude, never realizing that their surrender was already taking root. Louise spoke little as they ate, her silence itself a tool, allowing them to mistake her quiet for kindness rather than calculation. She called her practice the caretaker's gift, but in truth it was a ritual of stillness. Her kitchen drawers hid small glass vials of crushed seeds, bitter leaves, and distilled drops that no one else in the household dared touch. She blended them with care, always balancing just enough to loosen the body without breaking it too soon. To her, each guest was a candle. The sedatives were not meant to extinguish the flame, but to dim it, stretching the wick, ensuring it would last until Henri and Madeleine could work their will. Louise saw herself as the keeper of this balance, the one who turned panic into submission, struggle into quiet. Without her, the house would have been chaos. With her, it became a sanctuary of control. She convinced herself that her role was mercy. She told her own mind that she spared the boarders' fear by easing them into a state where screams caught in their throats and resistance dissolved before it began. When she stirred her soups, she imagined herself as a healer of sorts, a midwife guiding strangers into a different kind of birth. Not into life, but into stillness. It gave her purpose, a sense of order in a world where poverty and death were otherwise clumsy and brutal. To Louise, the way others died, crushed in mines, frozen in fields, drowned in rivers, seemed barbaric. She prided herself on providing a cleaner path, one that began with warmth and ended in silence. The townspeople admired her for her composure. Neighbors would sometimes visit at midday when the scents of broth drifted from her kitchen window and remark on her discipline, how she never complained despite the burden of strangers. They said she was a model of humility, a woman who knew her place and fulfilled it with grace. None could see the truth behind the ladle in her hand, nor the satisfaction that came when a boarder's head began to nod over his bowl. Her gentleness was not charity but a mask, the final disguise that cloaked the family's cruelty in the language of hospitality. At night, when the house had quieted and Henri checked his ledger, Louise would move from room to room smoothing blankets and watching as the tinctures took full hold. The guests lay sprawled across beds as if in peaceful sleep, their breathing slowed to shallow waves. She touched their foreheads not with affection but with a nurse's detachment, testing how deep the fog had sunk into them. Some stirred faintly, murmuring broken phrases. Others lay utterly still, unaware that they would never wake where they expected. In those moments she felt her own form of triumph, not loud, not cruel, but steady like a keeper locking away the world's noise. To Henri, she was indispensable. His ledgers meant nothing without the stillness she created, the blank spaces in which his records could be written. To Madeleine, she was teacher, showing how a smile and a spoon could be sharper than any blade. Louise never raised her voice, never struck a blow, yet her role was as central as the cellar itself. She was the threshold between life and what followed, the gentle hand that guided each boarder into the silence they would never escape. And so the house at Rue Saint-Cloîtres endured another season, its door welcoming the poor, its kitchen filling their bellies, its hostess smiling with the patience of a saint. None saw that the true sickness of the Marchand family was not only in the cellar nor in the ledger, but in the quiet comfort of Louise's soups, the meals that promised rest, and instead delivered them into the hands of death. Beneath the Marchand home, the cellar stretched lower than any neighbor imagined. Its entrance was hidden behind shelves of preserved fruits and jars of beans, a door that appeared ordinary until Henri's key scraped against its rusted lock. The air beyond was colder, weighted with damp earth, and the silence was thicker than that of the house above. This was not a cellar for storing wine or grain. It had been dug too deep, shaped too carefully, and prepared with a purpose that could never be spoken aloud. The walls were thick stone lined with iron rings, the ceiling supported by beams that sagged as if bowed by the weight of what had been done below. The space was organized with unsettling precision. Each wall carried niches padded with old wool and leather, places where bodies could be wedged into unnatural shapes. There were no chains hanging loose, no rattling manacles that might alarm a passerby above. The Marchands avoided such crude signs. Instead, they perfected methods of restraint that appeared almost surgical. A man might be forced to kneel with his chest pressed to his thighs, his arms bound tight around his legs, his head forced forward until every breath became a labor. A woman might be bent backward against a frame, her ribs stretched until each inhale tore at her chest. The cellar was not a dungeon of screaming iron, but a laboratory of slow collapse, where the body itself became the instrument of torture. Henri treated these positions as experiments, recording the exact angle of a spine, the number of hours before swelling cut off circulation, the moment when organs began to fail under pressure. To him, this was not sadism but study. He claimed order was only proven through endurance, and that to understand human fragility one must measure it without haste. Each victim became another page in his unspoken research, their pain reduced to notes in his ledger. His satisfaction lay not in the act of killing, but in the quiet control of time, the mastery of how long flesh and bone could withstand their unnatural prison before surrendering. Louise played her part in this chamber as well. She moved about with the calm of a nurse, checking pulses, wiping sweat from temples, listening for shifts in breathing. She did not see herself as a tormentor but as a caretaker, watching over lives that had already been claimed. She believed that easing their panic with her tinctures was an act of balance, ensuring the cellar did not descend into chaos. Madeline, young though she was, often crept into the shadows, her eyes wide as she studied the twisted figures. To her it was a kind of education, a dark apprenticeship in how silence could be imposed on the living without the crude use of blades. What made the cellar most terrifying was its quiet. Victims did not scream long. The positions themselves smothered the voice, pressed lungs until cries broke into weak gasps. Sometimes a muffled sob might carry through the beams above, but the townsfolk dismissed such sounds as the settling of an old house. Inside, the family listened with the calm detachment of scientists recording the last flickers of an experiment. Each shift in breath, each faint rattle in the throat became part of their hidden archive. Time in the cellar was measured differently. For those trapped within, minutes stretched into eternities, the body aching against itself in ways that could not be resisted. For the Marchands, hours passed like steady marks on a clock, each moment another step toward silence. When death finally came, it was not dramatic. It arrived like a dimming candle, quiet and inevitable. Henri would then mark a dash in his ledger upstairs, the final stroke of a life reduced to numbers and angles. The cellar with no windows became the heart of the house, pulsing with a rhythm of suffering that no one above could sense. It was not only a place of confinement but of transformation, where ordinary people, travelers, workers, widows, ceased to exist as individuals and became entries in Henri's book. The cellar consumed them as completely as fire, leaving only silence in its wake. And still the house above appeared clean and respectable, its shutters polished, its soup steaming with kindness. No neighbor guessed that beneath their feet stretched a chamber designed not for storage but for the dismantling of the human body. The cellar's darkness seeped upward, shaping the family's lives, feeding Henri's ledger, and preparing for the next boarder who would, unknowingly, descend into its grip. Henri Marchand's obsession deepened in the cellar, where stillness alone no longer satisfied him. He had begun to study breath, that fragile thread which tied body to spirit. To him, breath was not life's gift but its leash, and he believed that by learning to control it he could master the very boundary between existence and death. The ledger, already thick with dashes, now grew with a new category of notes, columns devoted to inhalations counted, to gasps measured, to the strange music of panic slowed into silence. What began as curiosity soon hardened into ritual, for Henri convinced himself that suffocation revealed truths no knife or poison could ever uncover. He devised his methods with the precision of a craftsman. Narrow copper tubes, polished until they shone, were pressed into the nostrils of his boarders. At first glance they seemed harmless, almost medical, but Henri used them to limit the intake of air until breathing became shallow and frantic. He watched as the body fought against itself, the chest rising in desperate jerks, the eyes rolling upward as each attempt at breath drew less than the last. The victims clawed at their faces, trying to wrench the tubes free, but Henri bound their hands and leaned close, listening, timing, recording. Every shuddering exhale was another data point in his quiet science. When the copper failed to interest him, he turned to water. He soaked strips of gauze and laid them across mouths already numbed by Louise's tinctures. The slow drip pressed into lips, into tongues, into throats, until the simplest act of breathing became a drowning. Unlike the rivers that claimed men quickly, Henri's gauze drowned them by inches. The panic was visible but muffled, the thrashing of bodies reduced to muted tremors. He noted how long it took before the will to fight dimmed, before eyes fixed and lungs convulsed against the final suffocating weight. He saw this not as cruelty but as art, a study of how far the body could be pushed before surrendering. His most chilling device was the bellows. In any other hands it might have revived a dying man, but Henri twisted its purpose. He used it to force air into lungs not to save but to prolong. A victim on the edge of unconsciousness would feel the rush of oxygen fill them, their body convulsing back into awareness, only to have the flow cut off again by a copper tube or dripping gauze. He stretched out their final panic into cycles of false hope and renewed terror, keeping them suspended between life and death until their bodies collapsed from exhaustion. In his ledger, he wrote these sessions in meticulous detail, noting the exact minute when breath ceased to return despite his manipulations. He saw himself not as killer but conductor, orchestrating the rhythm of fear until silence swallowed the last note. Henri's ritual of breath carried a twisted philosophy. He told himself that life was nothing more than a cage built around inhalation and exhalation, and that by controlling it, he could prove how fragile the human spirit truly was. He believed that the poor boarders who wandered into his house were already lost, forgotten by the world. By turning their final moments into study, he gave their lives a form of permanence in his ledger, a place in his archive that outlived them. In his mind, he was not destroying but preserving, capturing the essence of their struggle in the only way he knew how. Above ground, the Marchand house remained as silent and respectable as ever, its shutters clean, its soup steaming with comfort. But in the depths below, the air grew heavy with the echo of shallow gasps, with the quiet rhythm of bodies forced into silence by a man who saw suffocation not as crime, but as revelation. Each death was written down without remorse, another line in the ledger, another victory of order over life. And when Henri closed the book at night, he felt no guilt, only the satisfaction of a ritual complete, and the quiet anticipation of the next boarder whose breath he would soon claim. Louise Marchand's gentleness with the living was only matched by her tenderness with the dead. When a boarder's final breath rattled away in the cellar, it was often she who stepped forward first, her hands steady, her gaze unflinching. While Henri noted his last figures and Madeleine hovered at the edge of the room, Louise prepared her tools. She carried no knives, no crude instruments of dissection. Instead, she brought a small wooden box lined with cloth, a jar of ash, and a set of pliers worn smooth from years of use. She approached the body not as a grieving widow might, but as a gardener might approach soil ready for planting. To her, death was not an end, but a harvest waiting to be gathered. She worked with patience, easing open stiff jaws, whispering as if soothing a child. One by one, she pulled the teeth from the corpse, listening to the crack of roots breaking free from bone. Each snap was music to her, a reminder that nothing of the body resisted her care for long. The pliers never trembled in her grip. When she finished, she placed the teeth into her box as if they were precious seeds. She saw no horror in the act, only purpose. Teeth to Louise were fragments of permanence. Flesh decayed, hair withered, bones crumbled in time, but teeth endured. They were stubborn remnants of human life, and she believed that by planting them she could anchor the house to something eternal. In the garden behind the Marchand home, she had chosen a patch of earth hidden by hedges, a place where neighbors could not see. There the soil was mixed with ash from the hearth, and the fine powder of bones Henri ground down after the cellar's work was finished. Louise knelt over the dirt at night, pressing teeth into shallow rows like bulbs before spring. She covered them with care, whispering to them as she did when she tucked boarders into their beds upstairs. She called them her blossoms, promising they would grow strong and keep the house alive. To her mind, the survival of her family depended on this ritual, on feeding the soil with fragments of the vanished, so the house itself would never wither. Season after season, she tended her grotesque crop. In spring, when other gardens showed tulips and lilacs, hers revealed strange white flecks pushing up from the dirt, enamel glinting in the moonlight. She took these as signs of blessing, as proof the house was sustained by the offerings she had made. When neighbors commented on how well her hedges thrived, she smiled softly and said she used a special ash for her soil. None pressed further, for Louise's quiet composure disarmed suspicion. To them, she was simply devoted, a woman who knew how to make life bloom even in hard ground. Henry did not interfere in her work. He saw her garden as a complement to his ledger, another record of the family's mastery over disappearance. While his book preserved absence in ink, her rows of planted teeth turned that absence into something physical, rooted into the earth. Madeline, curious and eager, sometimes crouched beside her mother, arranging the smaller teeth into neat lines. She asked if they would bloom into flowers. Louise told her they already had, that each white point breaking through the soil was a blossom meant only for their family's eyes. The child grew up believing this ritual was natural, that gardens could be fed by silence as well as rain. The garden of teeth was more than superstition to Louise. It was her proof that order could grow out of ruin, that the house remained strong because the dead gave themselves back to its soil. She saw herself not as a monster but as caretaker of balance, ensuring that nothing was wasted, that every boarder who entered the house continued to serve its survival even after their lives had ended. In this belief she found comfort, a way to quiet any lingering tremor of doubt. At night, when the shutters closed and the house above fell into silence, Louise sometimes stood by her garden watching the moonlight strike the pale fragments just beneath the soil. She whispered her thanks to them, her blossoms of silence, her hidden crop that only she could tend. The neighbors slept unaware, but the ground behind the Marchand home pulsed with secrets, each tooth a root anchoring the family's darkness deeper into the earth. Louise Marchand's rituals began after the cellar fell quiet. When the body was still and Henri had closed his ledger, she prepared her own instruments, never rushing, never trembling. For her, death did not end with breath or with numbers written on a page. It continued through her work, in the fragile enamel she believed carried a kind of permanence. Teeth, she told herself, were fragments the earth respected. Flesh rotted, bone crumbled, but teeth endured. To her mind, they were seeds that could anchor the family's survival. So she harvested them with care, bending over the corpse as though she were a nurse tending a patient, easing open stiff jaws and coaxing free each piece with the pull of her worn iron pliers. The crack of roots leaving bone echoed in the cellar, a sound that would chill another woman. For Louise, it was a kind of music, a reminder that the body, even in death, could still give something back. She placed the teeth into a wooden box lined with cloth, arranging them neatly, never allowing one to fall out of order. When her work was done, she wiped the jaw clean with a rag and closed the eyes of the corpse with surprising tenderness, as though thanking it for its final gift. Then she carried her harvest upstairs, slipping silently into the night air where the hidden patch of garden waited. Behind the hedges, beneath the shade of a crooked tree, lay the soil she had been feeding for years. It was dark with ash and bone dust, tilled not with spades but with her bare hands, as if she wanted to feel each fragment join the earth. There, under the moon's thin glow, she pressed the teeth into shallow rows, spacing them with the precision of a farmer planting bulbs before spring. She whispered as she worked. Her words were quiet, intimate, meant only for the fragments in her hands. She called them her blossoms, promising they would grow strong and keep the house safe. Each tooth was planted like a prayer, a small white seed she believed would bind the house to the lives it had consumed. To her, the Marchand home thrived not only on rent and labor, but on offerings to the earth, offerings she alone could make. Louise saw herself as caretaker not of borders but of balance, ensuring that what was taken below returned above, feeding the ground that held their family upright. Seasons passed, and she tended the garden as if it were holy. In spring, while neighbors admired tulips and lilacs, Louise knelt among strange white flecks pushing up through the dirt, enamel glinting beneath the soil like frost that never melted. She traced them with her fingers, smiling faintly, convinced the house stood taller because of them. When townsfolk remarked on how green her hedges grew, she nodded politely and told them she used special ash in her soil. They never asked further. Louise's composure made them believe she was simply devoted, a woman who worked harder than most to keep her home in order. They saw nothing grotesque in the way she slipped outside after midnight, nor in the way she lingered at the earth with hands blackened by bone powder. Henri did not interfere. He watched her rituals with quiet approval, regarding her garden as the physical counterpart to his ledger. His book held the vanished in silence. Her rows of planted teeth turned that silence into roots. Both were records of permanence. Both ensured the family's work left a mark no outsider could erase. Madeleine, too, absorbed the practice, crouching beside her mother in the dirt, arranging the smaller teeth into neat lines and asking when the blossoms would bloom. Louise told her they already had, that their pale points breaking through the soil were flowers meant only for their family's eyes. For the child, this became as ordinary as any lesson, an inheritance of belief disguised as tradition. At night, when the house above seemed harmless in its stillness, Louise often lingered by her patch of earth, whispering her gratitude to the ground. She imagined the teeth pulsing faintly beneath the soil, sending roots downward, feeding the beams and stones of the house itself. She believed the Marchands could not fall while her blossoms thrived. To her it was proof that nothing was wasted, that every boarder who entered gave something lasting to the home that consumed them. And so the garden of teeth grew season after season, an unseen harvest sustained by silence, hidden in plain earth behind hedges no neighbor cared to notice. The Marchands chose their borders with the patience of hunters who knew the habits of prey. Their doors were never closed to the poor, the desperate, or the nameless. Travelers with little more than a bundle on their backs, widows carrying their last coins, laborers seeking work in the mills. These were the ones who stepped over the Marchand threshold. They were welcomed with soft words, warm broth, and the promise of rest at a price so low it seemed merciful. Few asked why such kindness was offered in a town where generosity was scarce. Fewer still recognized that the Marchands had built their business on one truth. The most useful victims were those no one would search for. The town accepted disappearances as part of life. Roads swallowed men in storms, ships vanished on rivers, women drifted from one village to another chasing work they never found. When a stranger was no longer seen at the market or on the road, the townspeople shrugged. Some muttered that they had moved on. Others whispered they had died of illness or despair. None looked to the Marchand house with suspicion. Why would they? The family appeared steady, polite, even dull. Their home was clean, their table welcoming. It was easier to assume the missing had chosen their fate than to believe they had been consumed in silence only streets away. Henri understood this complacency and relied on it. He recorded each guest in his ledger without hesitation, knowing their names meant nothing beyond the pages. A laborer from the north could vanish and no employer would ask after him. A widow could disappear and no kin would send letters inquiring of her fate. Foreigners left behind no one to vouch for them. The Marchands thrived on these shadows, perfecting the art of erasure by selecting lives that society had already dismissed. It was not chance but calculation that guided who crossed their doorstep. Louise's tenderness made the trap feel natural. She spoke to her guests as if she pitied them, urging them to eat heartily and sleep deeply. They mistook her softness for care, never realizing it was preparation. Madeleine's laughter in the courtyard gave the house a mask of family life, the skipping rope tapping on the stones as though to say all was normal here. The illusion was complete, and it was only later, when no one saw the traveler again, when no one remembered the widow's face, that the silence settled in. But by then, silence was all anyone expected. Authorities saw no crime in these vanishings. When a priest occasionally questioned the growing number of lost souls, he was told that drifters rarely left traces. They were the kind of people who disappeared everywhere, and to spend energy searching for them was to waste resources on the faceless. The Marchands knew this weakness of law, how it turned a blind eye to those who could not defend themselves. They understood that to kill the forgotten was not to invite justice, but to ensure it would never come. What made their crime more chilling was its normalcy. The boarding house never closed its shutters in fear, never shunned the eyes of neighbors. Its strength lay in the fact that no one wanted to ask questions about the poor, the foreign, or the unwanted. In that refusal, the family found their shield. They moved victims from table to cellar, from cellar to ledger, with the confidence of people who knew their acts were already hidden by society's indifference. Each absence became another thread woven into the fabric of the house. Teeth planted in Louise's garden, names marked with dashes. In Henri's book, whispers taught to Madeleine as if they were lessons in arithmetic. All of it depended on victims who entered willingly because they had nowhere else to go. The family thrived on silence not only of the dead but of the living around them, neighbors who chose blindness over horror. And so the house at Rue Saint-Cloîtres stood firm, its shutters gleaming in the sun, its broth steaming on the table, its family smiling with practiced humility. It thrived not in secrecy but in plain sight because the world outside did not care enough to look inside. In this indifference, the Marchands found their perfect camouflage, and within it, their evil was free to grow unchecked. The first person to sense the quiet rot beneath the Marchand home was not a magistrate or constable, but a priest. Father Delacroix had kept the parish books for years, noting baptisms, marriages, and burials with the same careful hand. He knew the names of the poor, the travelers, the widows who passed through his church doors to ask for bread or shelter. And he began to notice how often their trails ended at Rue Saint-Cloîtres. They arrived thin and hopeful. They sat in the pews whispering prayers. They were last seen walking toward the Marchand boarding house. And then they were gone. No letters arrived for them. No bodies were found in the fields, no goodbyes were spoken. They simply dissolved, like mist swallowed by the stone streets. At first he tried to dismiss it. The poor vanished often, swept away by sickness or work that took them far. Yet the pattern troubled him. He began to linger outside the Marchand house at dusk under the pretense of blessing a neighbor's door or visiting the sick. What struck him most was the silence. Other homes carried noise, arguments, children crying, music from a cracked window. But the Marchand home, once locked for the night, held a silence too perfect, too controlled. It was as though sound itself was not permitted to escape. The priest told no one at first. He feared being mocked for chasing shadows. But unease rooted itself in him and grew. Then came the storm. It was late autumn, and the town was drenched in rain that lashed at shutters and churned mud through the streets. The wind howled like a living thing, bending trees and rattling signs. Father Delacroix, restless and unable to pray, walked the lanes with his lantern shielded against the downpour. When he reached Rue Saint-Cloîtres, he paused. The Marchand house was lit in ways that unsettled him. Flickers of orange leaked through cracks in the shutters, brighter than any hearth fire needed to be. And beneath the roar of the storm, he swore he heard a muffled thudding as though something heavy shifted below ground. He stood there for long minutes, the rain running down his cassock, his lantern trembling in his hand. Then, by chance, the wind tore open one of the shutters on the house's lower windows. For an instant he saw it. A wavering shadow cast on stone, not the quick movement of family at chores, but something slower, more deliberate, too heavy to belong to ordinary work. Another shadow followed, bent at a grotesque angle, jerking in a rhythm that suggested not labor but struggle. Before he could lean closer, the shutter slammed shut again, cutting off the view. But the image stayed with him, the certainty that something unnatural moved within that house. He returned the next night and the night after. From the alley beside the house he caught faint glows from the cellar windows, lanterns carried back and forth in patterns that made no sense for cleaning or storing food. He thought he saw hands pressed briefly against the glass, pale and frantic, though the storm of rain may have distorted his sight. The priest's unease hardened into conviction. The Marchand family were not what they seemed. What weighed most on him was the loneliness of his suspicion. The townspeople dismissed his concerns, insisting that travelers always vanished, that the Marchands were good caretakers who asked for little and gave much. To accuse them was to accuse order itself. So he carried his burden alone, watching, waiting, certain that the truth of the house would one day spill out, as all buried things eventually do. That stormy night, the shadows he glimpsed through the lantern light were more than chance. They were the first cracks in the silence, the beginning of a dreadful unveiling that would not be stopped. And while Father Delacroix turned away with his heart hammering, the Marchands continued their work below, oblivious or perhaps indifferent to the eyes that had begun to linger on their walls. The night of the lanterns had come, and with it the first whisper of exposure, though the darkness of the cellar still held fast to its secrets. When the silence around the Marchand house finally broke, it was not with a confession but with the shovel's strike into earth. Investigators came reluctantly at first, pressed by whispers that had grown too loud to ignore, led by Father Delacroix's persistence and the unease of a few townsfolk who had begun to notice how many faces never returned from Rue Saint-Cloîtres. The Marchands were gone by then, the doors bolted, the shutters closed, the hearths cold. What remained was the house itself, holding tight to its secrets like a clenched jaw. The men who entered did so with lanterns in hand and unease in their eyes, expecting perhaps to find some sign of fraud or theft. What they uncovered was something far worse, a truth too heavy for words. The cellar was the first chamber to betray the family's work. Its floor was damp, its air foul with rot that years of lime could not disguise. On the walls, the investigators found the scars. Grooves dug deep into stone and timber, claw marks carved by fingernails desperate to find purchase in the dark. Each indentation was a frozen plea, a message left by those who had realized too late that no one would hear them. The padded niches stood open like coffins, their linings stained dark in patches that time had not erased. The iron ring still swung gently when touched, waiting for wrists that would never return. The men stood in silence, lanterns trembling as if the cellar itself were breathing with them. Outside, the soil gave up its own testimony. The garden Louise had tended with such patience bloomed with something no flower could mimic. The ground was rich with bone dust, and from it sprouted grotesque sprigs of calcified enamel, white fragments pushing through the dirt like unnatural blossoms. The investigators knelt in disbelief, pulling at the soil until teeth came loose in clusters, roots still dark with earth. The hedges, praised for their health, grew thick because they had been fed by the dead. Each spade of dirt unearthed more, ribs splintered, skulls cracked, femurs stacked carelessly beneath the roots. The garden was no garden at all, but a graveyard dressed in green. Pits were uncovered behind the house, shallow and many, each filled with the remains of countless boarders who had passed through without question. Some skeletons were incomplete, others crowded together, their bones tangled as though even in death they sought escape from one another. In one pit, investigators found small bones, unmistakably those of children, their teeth scattered among the larger remains. The men recoiled, yet they continued their work, compelled by a duty stronger than their disgust. The more they uncovered, the clearer the scale became. This was not the work of sudden madness. It was a system refined over years, a harvest of silence cultivated with care. Inside the house, Henri's ledger was found resting on his desk, its calfskin cover worn smooth, its pages filled with neat lines that always ended in a dash. The investigators flipped through, the names flowing endlessly, each one a life marked, consumed, erased. There were notes in the margins, brief figures, measures of hours, cryptic symbols that only Henri would have understood. To the investigators, it read not like a household book, but like scripture written by a hand that worshipped order over mercy. The ledger provided proof not only of the crimes, but of the coldness with which they were carried out. Each vanished soul had been catalogued, stripped of identity, reduced to ink on paper and bones in the earth. The discoveries spread through the town like poison. Neighbors who once praised the Marchands for their order and humility now swore they had always suspected something, though their silence had been the family's strongest ally. The priest, who had watched the lanterns flicker in stormlight, stood over the pits with his head bowed, whispering prayers that faltered in the air, unable to rise above the weight of what he saw. The house itself seemed to groan in the wind, its beams heavy with memory, its walls still holding the imprints of bodies pressed too long against stone. By the time the exhumations ended, there were more bones than anyone could count, more teeth than the ground should ever have held. The Marchands were nowhere to be found, but their legacy was written into the soil, into the cellar walls, into the ledger that remained open on the desk. The investigators closed the shutters of the house one final time, but they knew no lock or seal could contain the truth of what had been done within. The Marchand home had been fed on silence, and now silence was all it left behind. The trial of the Marchand family should have been a reckoning, but it unfolded like a whispered confession the town could barely stand to hear. The evidence was overwhelming. The ledger with its cruel dashes, the cellar with its claw marks, the garden seeded with teeth. Witnesses spoke of boarders who had entered the house and never reappeared, of lanterns flickering in stormlight, of the stench that clung to the earth behind the hedges. Yet as the words filled the courtroom, the townspeople averted their eyes. They listened with bowed heads, not because of grief, but because of shame. To accept the full truth was to admit they had lived alongside horror and chosen not to see it. Henri sat stiff and silent, his face calm even as the charges mounted. Louise wept on cue, her hands folded as if in prayer, while Madeleine watched with the blank stare of a child, too long steeped in cruelty to understand what was expected of her. The jury condemned them, but the sentences mattered less than the silence that followed. No one wanted to speak of the details. The papers printed vague phrases, unthinkable crimes, gruesome discoveries, but rarely mentioned the ledger or the garden. Priests warned against gossip, urging the faithful to look forward rather than dwell on the past. The Marchand name was scrubbed from records as though erasure could undo what the family had done. Still, the law changed in their shadow. Boarding houses were required to register every guest with the parish, to record not only arrivals but departures. Inspectors were given the right to enter homes unannounced, searching cellars, counting beds. These reforms were spoken of with pride, as if they had grown from wisdom rather than from the soil of horror. The town claimed progress, yet no plaque bore the names of the missing, no monument listed the lives reduced to numbers in Henri's ledger. For years, families who inquired after lost sons or widowed daughters were told their kin had perished in some nameless misfortune. Their connection to the Marchand house left unspoken. Behind the walls of an archive, Henri's ledgers were sealed in a box. The officials who catalogued them trembled as they touched the pages. Each neat line of handwriting seemed to pulse with control, with the cold precision of a man who reduced suffering to record-keeping. Scholars avoided them, convinced that to study them too closely was to invite contamination. They remained locked away, not destroyed, not displayed, but preserved in silence, as if the town feared both forgetting and remembering. It was a compromise, a way of hiding the truth in plain sight, a ledger of absence buried within a ledger of history. The Marchand house itself was torn down, its stones repurposed for other buildings, its beams burned. Yet those who lived nearby swore that the ground remained sour, that no grass grew right where the cellar had once gaped open. At night, some claimed to hear faint scratching beneath the soil, as if the marks on the cellar walls had sunk deeper, etched into the very earth. Whether superstition or truth, the whispers carried a lesson the town refused to say aloud. Silence does not vanish when walls fall. It lingers, taking root in memory. Evil, the story of the Marchands showed, does not always scream. It does not need the mask of monsters or the frenzy of violence. It thrives in routine, in the politeness of a woman serving soup, in the calm ledger of a man who notes names with neat precision, in a family that seems no different from any other until it is too late. It thrives when neighbors choose not to ask questions, when authorities dismiss disappearances as fate, when towns prefer order to truth. The legacy of the Marchands was not only in the bones pulled from the earth, but in the silence that followed. A silence that protected them for years and then buried their story in shame. And so the question lingers even now, long after the Marchand house has been erased from the street. What do you think? Could this happen again? Hidden behind respectability, cloaked in normalcy, waiting in the silence of families who seem ordinary until silence swallows their victims whole.